Did ancient Ireland have a caste or class system? Well, Dagdy Agus Fáilte. Hi, hello, and welcome. Jon O'Sullivan, Irish Pagan School here. And I have been doing a series where I dive into the Brehon Laws, which are the ancient or old laws of Ireland. Brehon being the Old Irish word for judge, and they were a subcategory or subclass of the druids in Ireland. Um, so I've been kind of moving through these old laws, and trying to explore and understand what Irish culture and society was like through the lens of its legal structure. And it's important to kind of understand that the legal structure of Ireland wasn't punitive justice, it was restorative justice. So it wasn't a case of, okay, well, you've committed a crime, we're going to incarcerate you or slay you or dismember you. There was a quantifiable cost for everything, and then everything had to be restored or made right by payment of an honor price, or by, in some cases, actually, working for the offended individual until your offense or damage has been paid off. And so, in order to understand the importance of this legal structure, we kind of need to be understand the society in which it was built, the culture, where it all came from, and how it all existed like for like. And the fascinating thing about this is this hierarchical structure of ancient Ireland existed between the 5th and the 12th centuries. So that's 700 years. So it's 700 years of this tribal culture. But what's very interesting about it, well, I find it very interesting about it, is the fact that the Brehon laws applied everywhere across the island, regardless of your tua or your tribe or your onuses or allegiances. This law structure existed outside of one particular kingdom or tribal land. It was adopted and it was honored by everyone in the island. And so, looking at the extensive and in-depth and detailed nature of Irish structure based on these law tracts and law texts that we have, really shows us the detail that Ireland wasn't some barbarous landscape of horror and terror. Now, again, it wasn't an egalitarian paradise either. It was hierarchical and inegalitarian. But that doesn't mean there wasn't clear structure, clear rule of law, laws around hospitality, laws around harm and care. So when we look at the structure of our society, there is so much to go into. It is huge, and here's me trying to do a YouTube video about it. But the sources I've pulled out for the kind of the hierarchy structure, which is what I'm going to cover in this video, um, there's three main texts. There's the Bretha Corlaige, so that's Bretha, and then Crolaige, Cro Fada, Lige. Then there is the Crich Gavalach, Cri Fada, and then Gablach, Gablach, which is the ordering of society, is kind of what that one translates as. And then there's the Urucht Vec, so that is the Uraicecht, and then Bec, Becc. Now, I'm spelling those out because those are the old Irish terms, but if you were to kind of look those up online, you will be able to find content on it on places like UCC Celt with the Celt Project, or ancienttext.org. So there is links to try and get into these resources if you want to explore it for yourself as well. You don't have to be solely reliant on me. But if you're a book person, here is the Guide to Early Irish Law. This is by Fergus Kelly, and this is the physical book that I am referring to for a lot of this actual work. It comes from the Irish Pagan School library, as invested in by my darling beloved Laura O'Brien, because I mentioned doing stuff on the law, and Laura's like, "Oh, here's this book right off the shelf," and I'm loving it. I'm actually recording myself reading chapters of the book. If anyone would be interested in hearing the recordings of me reading each chapter by chapter, let me know. Or maybe we can find a way to post it for free as a reference guide. But anyway, back to our topic and back to the information we have on the structure of our society. So, as I mentioned, for this 700-year period, we have records that kind of let us know there was 150, at least 150 different kingships or tribal lands. And the fact that the laws applied all across all of these tribal lands, it really shows the interconnectedness between the tribes, that there were people who moved around the country outside of their own tribal land to share information, to share judgments, and those people were the Brehons. So these Brehons, these were a caste, as I said, judges who would go around. Now, of course, you had your tribal judge, your Brehon that stayed with the king, but there were other people who were trained in these laws, and they would provide their services by going place to place and dealing with any disputes. So what is a tribe? Like, how do we quantify what a Tua or tribe is? Well, it actually gives us a clear line on that. It does say that, well, actually, the wording on it I thought was fun. It says that is not a tribe which has no king, no druid, and no filla. So, in order to pretty much have a tribe, you need to have a king or a chieftain. You need to have a druid. Now, later on, they kind of subbed out the word druid and tr put in cleric because this is very clearly we can see it in later texts from the 700 Common Era onwards. We see this really dominance of the Catholic Church kind of coming into it. And so, when we talk about Tuatha or tribal lands or chieftains, later legal texts begin to include the church as a tua or as a tribe, and its chieftain is its abbot, and then its lords are its bishops. So, but the fundamentals, the baseline, you have to have at least a chieftain, a druid, and a filla. The fact that the filla or the poet is there in this core structure of Irish society. Actually, I'll do a video separate on filla later on. So if you're interested in the laws around filla, make sure you're following along for this series I'm doing. But breaking down, like, we look at the information from this 500 to 1200, the 700-year series. The experts kind of estimate that there was a population in Ireland of about a half a million. And if we take that with the 150 different territories or tribal lands, this means that each had a population or capacity somewhere in the region of 3,000 men, women, children. So how do you organize your society when you have 150 different kingships and each of those had 3,000 people approximately? Well, this is where we get into the very detailed layering and caste system. So, neat answer, not hard to say. Yes, ancient Ireland had a very clear delineations about caste and class within the society. But unlike other early societies or early cultures around the world, it wasn't closed. It wasn't restricted to, well, that's it. You're born here, you die here. Like for a lot of people, it was, but there were very clear guidelines as well, how your class, your status, your rank within society can change both up, but also down. So these laws applied to everyone from the top end of society right the way down. But what does the top end of society look like? Well, we have a word for that, and the word is Nemed. So that's Nemed. And the translation that's given for Nemed is privileged or a person of privilege. And these are usually individuals born into a hereditary circumstance, but it may also include people of exceptional skill, talent, unique crafts that are crucially important to the tribe, or also people of sufficient wealth that they are themselves supporting people under them, like as in Lord category. So, to break these down, there is a couple of terms we use. So we have the Rí Ruach, and so that's Rí or I fada, and then Ruach or Uirech or Ruach. And this was a supreme king. So this was a king over all other kings. Now, someone may claim, and we have a lot of history, a lot of documents, a lot of medieval manuscripts and pre-medieval manuscripts where people claim to be a supreme king or a king or high king. There's no actual evidence to say that someone did 100% dominate all of Ireland and become a high or supreme king. The title kind of best, the person who kind of best or closest within historical record to claim and kind of back up this title was none other than Brian Boru. So Brian Boru coming out of Munster gained like the kingship of Thomond and then began a conquest all across the island. He is said within the histories to have conquered the tribes up in the north of Ireland, which no Munster king had ever done before. And for a period of time, he did declare himself the Rí Ruach, the Supreme King of Ireland. But below that, within the structure, there's also a Rí Túaithe. So that's Rí again, or I fada for king, and then Tua, T-U fada A-T-H. But this is a king over many tribes. So you would have each of your tribes, as we see, each of your Tua would have to have a king. Otherwise, it's not a Tua. But some of those kings, some of those tribes or chieftains, would owe their allegiances or may have been conquered or dominated by another local lord or local chieftain, in which case they owe their allegiances not to their own, well, to their own Tua, of course, but they have an other onus to this other king in another Tua. And so this overlordship or one who rules over other Tuas was a Reed Tua. Now, of course, I did mention each Tua has to have a king or a chieftain. So then there is the Rí Túaithe, which is spelled different and pronounced different. So this is Ora Fada for Rí, and then Tuaithe. So this is a king over one tribe. So this is the one king over the one tribe. And that kind of covers our chieftain category. But there's a number of other lord individuals that we need to include in this. And the lords are Ara, A-I-R-E. And so there was a rank or a status known as a Ara Forgil, and the Ara Forgil was a Lord of Supreme Testimony. Now, this may, in fact, also have been the Brehon or the judge within that tribe, but there was a title or a recognition for a Lord of Supreme Testimony. We then have the Ara Tusha, which is T-U for the T-U-I for the S-E-O, Tusha, which is the Lord of Precedence, which may also be another like legal circumstance for your Brehon, but could also be and also the supreme testimony, the Ara Forgil, could also be someone of excellence. So someone of a supreme craft or a very core craft, like a blacksmith, a wright, or a physician, could fulfill that role because they would give the supreme testimony on a particular topic, or they would be able to show this is the precedence based on their skill, and the weight of what they would offer, especially in legal testimony, was taken based on their value and their rank within society. Of course, if your rank in society was higher than someone else's rank, then your word or your honor was greater than theirs and held a greater weight. But it also means that abuses of your honor meant that you had a lot more to lose should you lose your rank by boot. Well, I suppose I'll need to touch on how would you lose your rank maybe a little bit later on. Um, but after that we have the Aire Ard or a High Lord. But the last rank in this Nemed class was known as the Aire Jesho. So that's Aire, A-I-R-E, and then Jesho, D-E for the S-O. This one is very fascinating because it's referred to as a lord of vassalry. And when we talk about the caste system or people of privilege in Irish society, the Arageso is proof that someone not born into the craft or born into this Nemed structure can find their way into the Nemed structure if they are descended from someone of wealth and privilege and status. So they might not have the lineage of status or be born with that into an Nemed, but the Arageso is someone whose family have done so well for themselves that they can become treated as Lord and have the same honor prices and same privileges as someone born into the Nemed. Now, so that's the first kind of category. But then within that, we have those who are, of course, not Nemed. So there's this category of privilege, but then there's these other individuals. So within those who are not Nemed, at the kind of top end of it, there's a person known as a Bóaire. So this is B-O-Fada A-I-R-E. And a Bóaire is said to be a wealthy or strong farmer. Now, the B-O-Fada is the Irish word for cow. A lot of these farmers had cattle and kept cattle. That was a symbol of wealth and one of the core structures of wealth in the country. So the fact that we have this it's almost like a cow lord in this wealthy farming caste really shows the importance of cattle in the naming of it. Below that, a slightly less prosperous farmer or a small farmer is known as a Ócaire. So that's Ófada C-A-I-R-E. And those are the two main individuals who are considered free. So this is the other side of the structure. So you have those who are Nemed, privileged, and those who are not Nemed, unprivileged. But then there's also those who are Ser, S-O for the E-R, and those who are Der, D-O for the E-R. So those who are Ser are considered free, and those who are Der are considered unfree. Now, the Bóaire and the Ócaire are people who are farmers. They would go to an individual, they would gain a loan or a stipend from them to start up their own farming structure. They then have to pay taxations in like a portion of their produce to the person who gave them their start or their beginning. And this is how the lords, the Aire Ard, High Lords, or the Aragesho create this structure. And so the Bóaire and the Ócaire are free men. They have their own titles and their own honor prices. They might not be Nemed, but they are people of value and significance in their own way. Below that, though, are the Der, which are the unfree. So these are people who still have a status. They still have a rights. They're still people of value. They have an honor price for some of them, but they're not free. They don't have the same levels of, openness to move, to trade, to make agreements in any way, shape, or form. And so the first one at it again going down in structural society here is the Fuidir, Fuidir, and the Fuidir was considered a semi-free man or a tenant of will. So this is someone who, you know, may not be able to run a farm themselves. They might not be able to get the beginnings, the investment from a lord to become a farm. So they would then go and they would give their labor. They would kind of sell their labor to maybe an Ócaire or a Bóaire. And so they then are this fuidir, this class. So they're choosing to engage in tenancy. They're choosing to engage in shared labor. Now, below a fuidir, if a fuidir or the fuidir's children, for example, isn't able to change their cash, their fortune, or engage or build wealth or begin to grow beyond, or even marry into wealth. I did a video on marriage, it was slightly different. They might become then what's known as a botach, Botach, which is a cottage person. So it's someone living in others' lands, living in an Ucker's land or a tenant on a lord's land, for example, and their status within society is lower and lesser because they're not running a farm themselves. They are sharing and giving their labor. Now they still receive payments for the effort that they're putting in. They still have a price should harm be done to them, and they still have a liability should they do harm to other people. But if a buttock, and actually, if a buttock remains in their caste or in their status for 3 generations, as in 3 generations living in the same cottage, living in the same tenancy cottage on another person's land, they change and to become known as a Sean Céileatha. So that's an Sencleithe, a Sean Céileatha. And it's termed as a hereditary serf, but it's the Sean Céileatha is a person of old huts. So, because the hut has existed there for so long, because it's 3 generations of living in that territory, working in that territory, the person gets this status. Now, they will never be able to move outside of this status. Like they are bound to this structure for their lives. But that also means that they cannot be removed from the hut. They are people of that land. They are people of that territory. So even if the land itself is sold to some other lord or given to a different Ócaire or Bóaire for processing, the hut remains on the land, and the people of that hut have a right to remain on that land, and their effort and labor is transferred with the land itself. So there's no kind of removing or kicking of people out of tenancy if they are there for that length of time. They just go with the land, and their offer and service is then part of that value for the land itself. There was a lower caste in society, and that was a slave, and they were known as a mug. A mug, it was a male slave, and they had no rights and they were property. Now, there is also a cummel, which is the word for a female slave, but the cummel kind of had more value in a way than a male slave. And they were property. They had zero rights. Now, how one became a slave could be in response to a criminal act and they have to pay that off over time. They weren't the same as like other cultures, slaves and people who were like captured or forced into slavery. Some of these occasions are where someone can't pay off their rent and their kin group, they're disowned from them. Their only opportunity really is in this form of indentured servitude. So they have value, but they don't have rights in that circumstance. Another interesting category of people was known as a Mur Coirithe. A Mur Coirithe. Now I will spell that. It's Murchoirthe. And a Mur Coirithe is someone thrown up by the sea or a castaway. So, of course, Ireland being an island, we had people come in from the sea. They come in as a castaway. So they are again people of no legal standing. So they are not people of tribe. They're not recognized as people of Tua. They would have no one to advocate for them, no kin group in which to support them. But they could still be taken in. They could still be brought in as a buttock or in some cases as a mug to survive and to live. But interestingly, when we look at the Mur and then take other sections of the law around punishment, some of the punishments for a person who's unable to, again, as I said, it's restorative justice for the most part. But if a person doesn't have a kin group to support them in payments of their fines, doesn't have like a lord who covers them for payments of the fines, that person may be cast off the island. So they would be put on a boat without oars as a punishment and just pushed out to sea. Of course, the tidal areas around Ireland, they might just float down around the coast and then come back onto the island somewhere else. But the moment that they come back on, they are more coirithe, they are cast away from the sea and have no legal rights whatsoever. Now, I've mentioned kin group a couple of times here, and I think it's important to kind of come back to talk about kin group because, yes, of course, Ireland was tribal. Yes, of course, it was 150 different kingships, and each of those kingships had this very clear structured society. But you also had your ownership and your onuses towards kin and towards family. And the relationship was such that an individual's successes benefited not just themselves, but also their family. In the same way, though, an individual's discretions or liabilities cost the family. So, when we look at the laws around family, there's a lot now. A big chunk of this does come into marriage and fa interfamily marriages. So, if two people of same status, or two children of people of same status, like two children of say Boers, these wealthy farmers want to marry, the two kin groups come together and they say, okay, well, we're of similar status. We're both going to put up X amount of investment in this relationship, and then this new couple begins their life from there. The kin group predominantly carries with the males, but also with the females. So women who marry into these relationships, they're not cast off by their kin. They retain their relationship with their kin. And this was important because within each kin group, there was also kin land. So this was a section of property or land that all of the kin, all of the people in that family group had an investment in and had a share in. And so if someone had a liability placed against them that they couldn't cover themselves, the kin group would have a kind of restriction or a distraint placed against their lands until they made the payments to cover for that. So this was also important because the kin groups would elect someone who spoke for them, who's ahead of the kin group to speak on their behalves in legal gatherings and in important circumstances. And the importance of this was down to this honor price that I mentioned. I might actually do a video on prices and like costs. Maybe if people are interested, do let me know. But a lot of this is referred to as your face. So your honor was based on your face, or your face value. Actually, I wonder if that's where face value comes from. So anything that would infringe your honor or would demean you in front of other people could be it would seen as damaging your face or damaging your public persona of honor. And so the head of a kin group could step in on behalf of all of the people and say, okay, well, here's our collective honor behind all of this. And then they vouch for and they speak for their kin group. Now, this was very powerful in giving assurances. This was very powerful and important when making legal contracts or agreements, again, like marriages, for example. But this did expose the head of the group personally to a certain amount of liability in the form of satire. So, one of the talking earlier on about how people may lose their status within society is if they're not performing their jobs. Yes, even kings had jobs. The king had to declare Éineachs, which is gatherings for the tribe to come and talk to. They also had to declare like wars or raids in all those circumstances. The king had to make sure he went nowhere without his entourage. Depending on the level and status of a king, that could be anywhere from 10 to 60 people. And you must not be seen without your posse or your entourage. But the king's job was to take the taxation he's paid and invest in the roads to make sure that the infrastructure of his tribal lands supports all of the people of the lands. So, and also the security of said roads that were being built was the king's job. So, a lot of very detailed, very important parts of it. Oh, actually, there was an interesting prohibition I found. These Rí characters, these chieftains, they had very important roles to take care of, management agreements. They also sat as brehons or judges in some cases, and when more than one judge was called for, the king would sit there too. But there was a prohibition on kings to do manual labor. And if, in fact, if a king was caught like digging with a shovel, felling a tree, they would lose their status because not that it was mundane work and how dare they do mundane work. It's the fact that surely you must have more fucking important things to do than be felling trees and digging ditches. So these individuals, and again, being a king wasn't just a hereditary. You're just father was a king or your mother was a king or queen. Being a king was an elected position put forward by anyone who has the right to become a king. So whoever is the king, any of their grandchildren or great grandchildren or great great grandchildren could throw their hat in the ring to become the next king when the top king dies. And they were judged based on their abilities, based on their histories, based on their success with raids, but also on this extra kind of almost unquantifiable excellence. So the word is excellence. Now I don't have the Irish word in my head right now, but they had to display some excellence in something. That could be anything. Excellence in art, excellence in music, excellence in poetry, excellence in skill in battle, excellence in judgment. All of these, they had to have some excellence for them to be worthy to be accepted, to be nominated as the king. And then once those who put forward their names to be successfully nominated, the rest of the tribal lords would come together and say, okay, well, we back this person or we back that person. So being a king was a job. It was very, very important. And there's a lot of things that you could lose your status of if you went against your focus, if you went against the job you're supposed to be doing, as I mentioned, but also if you stood a satire, if a satire was placed against you, justly and you allowed that to stick because of your poor behaviors or because you didn't make right by it, you'd lose your status. And that could satire you right the way out of your Nemed class, out of your privileged class, and then you become a regular layperson or a common person. You might have wealth, you might have status, or might have had status, but your honor price is now gone because you have breached and broke with the laws and the structures that applied all across the island. I feel like I've been rambling for quite a bit now. You can probably tell I'm very, very fascinated by this area, and I'm chunking through so much of it. I'm literally reading the book and recording myself at the moment doing it because it helps me get the structure of this information into my mind and retain it. So I'm really enjoying it. I've done other videos on here, the law of trees, for cats, for bees. I've done marriage there, and I'm hopefully going to be turning up for more for the rest of the week and doing more of these videos. If you'd like to know more about Irish mythology, culture, spirituality, and practices, we got you covered. irishpagan.school/free will give you a list of free classes, free information, free resources you can download and dive into, free guided meditations if you want to explore the spiritual aspects of all of this too. And as ever, until next time, hit the like and subscribe thing. Throw a comment down below if you had any questions or queries about this, and I will do my best to come back and answer them as well. Until next time, look after yourself. Take care. Agus Salon. Goodbye.